Well, we had some internet problems, and I'm back. So if you're watching this, please watch part 1 of July 20th, 2023 first, and then it cuts off about 20 minutes into it, and I'm going to assume that I'm live. So let me continue. So we reported yesterday on the Michigan State Attorney General indicting 16 fake electors in Michigan for conspiring to defraud the federal government by forging documents and lying about Michigan's election results, claiming Trump, not Joe Biden, won the popular vote. Michigan has 16 electoral votes. They all went to Joe Biden. The Michigan State Attorney General, therefore, has indicted all 16 of the phony electors who met illegally in the basement of the Michigan Republican Party headquarters to sign phony and forged documents claiming to be the rightful slate of electors who should be presented to Congress. That is conspiracy to defraud the government. And you know it didn't start in Michigan. I talked about this yesterday. This conspiracy came from Trump and his associates in the White House. The 16 indicted phony electors are going to flip and tell the state attorney general who orchestrated this, okay? The other statute in the target letter is pretty much straightforward, and that is witness tampering. Witness tampering. There's a distinct possibility that Donald Trump will be indicted this week for witness tampering. We saw that in last year's January 6th committee hearings when Liz Cheney openly accused Donald Trump of trying to silence several witnesses who then refused to testify before the January 6th committee. That is witness tampering. It gets even worse. Cassidy Hutchinson worked for Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows. She testified before the January 6th committee last year that Trump provided her, free of charge, with an attorney who prepped her for the January 6th committee hearings. That attorney's name was Stefan Passantino. But she fired him because, she claims, he was advising her to mislead the committee. Passantino denies he told Cassidy Hutchinson to lie before the January 6th committee, but the January 6th committee recommended in their final report that the Justice Department investigate lawyer Stefan Passantino for possible witness tampering. In April of this year, Passantino sued the January 6th committee, which doesn't exist anymore, but he sued them anyway, for spreading a false narrative about him, witness tampering, right? But in March of this year, several dozen top attorneys, including past presidents of the American Bar Association and the District of Columbia Bar Association, they announced that they would seek to revoke Passantino's law license. In a complaint before Washington, D.C.'s Board on Professional Responsibility, in this complaint, all these top legal minds accused Passantino of the following crimes: subornation of perjury, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and bribery. Bribery, yes. The bribery, according to this complaint, was Passantino, the lawyer for Trump, promising Cassidy Hutchinson that if she kept her mouth shut before the January 6th committee, she would, quote, get a really good job in Trump world, quote, unquote. Trump world. Trump world, right? Passantino took a leave of absence from his law firm, and in January of this year, he landed a really good job in Trump world. He's working for the Trump Organization. Keep your mouth shut, you get a job in Trump world. Meanwhile, lawyers defending American democracy have also filed a complaint against Passantino. in New York and Georgia, where Passantino has been admitted to the bar. It's really hard to disbar lawyers here in the United States, and that's the problem. That's the problem. Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen, says Trump engaged in witness tampering, attempting to strong-arm him and intimidate him into not testifying against the Trump organization. Now, according to the Washington Post, it is rare for the Justice Department to bring charges of witness tampering when it comes to testimony before a congressional committee, even though witnesses before a congressional committee are sworn in under oath with the threat of perjury. It does happen. Roger Stone was pardoned by Donald Trump after he was prosecuted and found guilty of witness tampering. Roger Stone had to be pardoned by Donald Trump for witness tampering. If you remember, he tried to intimidate a friend of our show, Randy Credico, the great comedian and political activist. Randy Credico was friendly with Roger Stone, and Credico was asked to testify before the House Intelligence Committee back in 2017 about the role Roger Stone played in coordinating with WikiLeaks to release embarrassing emails that Russian hackers retrieved from a Democratic Party headquarters server. Remember that? The emails, the WikiLeaks emails that the Russians got from hacking into the DNC. Those emails served as a major embarrassment for Hillary Clinton back in 2016. The emails exposed how she conspired with the DNC to rig the primaries against Bernie Sanders. Well, Roger Stone didn't want Randy Credico to talk about Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and the role Roger Stone might have played in all that. And he got convicted for witness tampering, Roger Stone. Trump, as I said, had to pardon him, but they did get him for witness tampering. And I think Roger Stone threatened to kill Randy Credico's dog if he testified against him, I think. So, yeah, witness tampering, that's mentioned in the Target letter. It's pretty straightforward, and that seems to be what Special Counsel Jack Smith will be zeroing in on when he arrests Trump, supposedly today or tomorrow. The third federal statute is deprivation of rights under color of law, and it sounds more confusing than it is. Stay with me on this because it's kind of interesting. So, color of law, deprivation of rights under color of law. Color of law means legal authority. Of course, you can't say that because these lawyers who write these laws spent, hundreds of thousands of dollars on a fancy education, so they can't use terms like legal authority. They have to say color of law, so only people with fancy educations can understand this shit. Color of law means legal authority. For example, every time a police officer, I need some water. Every time a police officer pulls you over, they are acting under the color of law, which means they have a legal authority granted to them by the Constitution as well as state and local law. And because a police officer is acting under the color of law, they are forbidden from using that legal authority or the color of the law to violate someone's constitutional rights. Okay, this is a law that dates back to right after the Civil War, I think, right? For example, under the color of the law, a police officer can pull you over, but he can't arrest you without probable cause. That would be deprivation of rights under color of the law. Rewind this to hear this again because it's a little complicated. Now, this law applies to the President of the United States. The President has the legal authority, the color of law, to perform countless duties, right? If a president uses the authority granted to him by the Constitution or by a federal law, if he uses, according to this law that is mentioned in the target letter, if the President of the United States uses his authority, his legal authority as President of the United States to deprive any Americans of their constitutional rights, then he is in violation of this federal statute, which might be one of the laws Jack Smith is reportedly going to apply in order to indict Donald Trump. Again, this is the statute of the three statutes I've mentioned. This is the one that is most difficult for most of us to understand. There are a host of reasons you can charge Trump with deprivation of rights, constitutional rights, under the color of the law. For example, if you are an elector, if you're an elector, in the Electoral College, Donald Trump could be accused of depriving you of your constitutional right to serve as an elector if he engages in trying to stop the certification of a presidential election on January 6, 2021. He is using his authority as president to deprive voters of their constitutional right to have their vote counted. If Donald Trump uses his legal authority to stop the certification of the presidential election on 2020, he is depriving Congress, members of Congress, of their constitutional right to certify a presidential election. This is deprivation of constitutional rights under color of the law. Again, you're not supposed to understand this. You're supposed to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to law school so you can come up with complicated statutes like this that makes no sense to anybody, but nobody's willing to admit that it doesn't make any sense. But let me try to explain deprivation of rights under color of law. This is the third statute that there's a distinct possibility Special Counsel Jack Smith will invoke this statute to indict Trump. For example, Trump used his legal authority, the color of the law, to bully federal subordinates as well as state officials into lying about the 2020 election results. He used his legal authority, the color of the law, to bully subordinates into falsely claiming election fraud. He deprived Congress of its constitutional right to certify the election on January 6. He did that by ordering what essentially amounted to his own paramilitary thugs. He ordered them to storm the Capitol. Many of these thugs believed they were acting on orders from the President of the United States, which in many ways they were. Okay? Stuart Rhodes is a Yale Law School graduate and founder of the Oath Keepers, and he is now doing time for seditious conspiracy because of the role he played on January 6. During the trial earlier this year, his attorney said that as Rhodes understood the role he was playing on January 6, his understanding was that President Donald Trump was, under the color of the law, under his legal authority as President of the United States, Stuart Rhodes, Yale Law School, doing time for seditious conspiracy, as he understood it, in the lead up to January 6th, the President of the United States was going to invoke emergency powers granted to him by Congress, and the color of the law, Trump's legal authority, allowed Trump to deputize Stewart Rhodes and the Oath Keepers to help restore order on January 6. Someone, if you look at the transcripts of this trial, someone from the Trump White House convinced Stewart Rhodes that Donald Trump was going to use emergency powers granted to him by Congress to invoke some kind of martial law and deputize the Oath Keepers to restore order, or God knows what. It was Stewart Rhodes, Yale Law School graduate. It was his understanding that Trump would be using his legal authority to invoke emergency powers to deprive Congress of its constitutional rights to certify a presidential election on January 6th. And we don't talk about this enough. Under the National Emergency Act of 1976, the President of the United States has, under the color of the law, he has the legal authority. He has 136 emergency powers that he can invoke. Some of those powers entitle the president to act unilaterally, just by himself. Others, most of the powers require congressional consent. But it goes without saying that in the lead up to January 6th, Donald Trump legally was the most powerful person in America. And under the color of the law, he could and did order his inferiors within the executive branch to deprive members of Congress of their constitutional rights to certify an election. Under the color of the law, Donald Trump deprived electors, legitimate electors, to serve in the Electoral College. He deprived you and me, voters, of our constitutional right to have our votes counted. The only thing that kept the entire system from collapsing under the weight of Trump's legal authority granted to him by the Emergency Act of 1976, the only thing that kept Trump from doing God knows what kept this from happening was the large swath of Republican appointees who essentially defied Trump's orders. The system held on January 6th barely because there were still Republicans in the Justice Department and the Defense Department who refused to obey Trump's orders. And one of the heroes, it pains me to tell you, is the odious Vice President Mike Pence. It pains me to no end to say that you cannot overstate Mike Pence's heroics on January 6th. I know. I hate saying this, but the more I read about January 6th, the more I have come to understand that the only thing that kept January 6th from spilling over into the streets across America, the only person who stopped that was Mike Pence, defying Donald Trump's order not to certify the presidential election. I hate Mike Pence. I hate to say that he is a profile in courage. Unfortunately, he is. He is a horrible human being, and by definition, that is what a profile if you read Ted Sorensen's book that Jack Kennedy took credit for and got the Pulitzer, but it was written by Ted Sorensen. By definition, a profile in Courage is a horrible human being, a horrible politician who steps up once and does the right thing and pays a political price for it. By definition, that is what a profile in Courage is. Had Mike Pence, I hate Mike Pence, but had he obeyed Trump and refused to certify that election, we'd be looking at a completely different beast. And it's all because of Mike Pence. Do not tell me that Mike Pence would have been in direct violation of the Constitution if he refused to certify. I don't want to hear that. Don't tell me he had no authority. Don't tell me the role of the vice president on January 6th is purely ceremonial, because it doesn't matter what the law or the Constitution says, right? Trump would already be in prison if it mattered what the law and the Constitution says, okay? Had Mike Pence obeyed Trump, the law would not have mattered. Had Mike Pence not certified, it would have opened the floodgates for constitutional mischief, with countless lawyers and Republican leaders willing to make the case that Pence did have the authority not to certify. Okay? On January 6th, there was just enough wiggle room in the Constitution, in the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I'll talk about that in a second. There was just enough wiggle room for Pence to get away with not certifying the election. It's a case, a phony case, but a case that could be made that Mike Pence would be well within his constitutional rights to prevent the election from being certified. He would have slowed the process down. That was the plan. There was a plan. The plan was to stop the certification, to slow it down. The plan was to slow the certification down to buy Trump and his lawyers more time to create a groundswell in the Republican Party and in Congress and in the Supreme Court to challenge the entire election. The plan was partly to turn it over to the Supreme Court or Congress. If it went to Congress to vote for the president, which was part of the plan, because of the laws, because of the Electoral Count Act of 1877, Republicans would have controlled more states than Democrats do. And so Republicans would have been able to vote Trump into office. They would have reelected Donald Trump because of the way states are weighted according to the Electoral Count Act of 1887. The Republicans had an advantage. And so the plan was to create chaos, sow doubt, have Pence not certify, have Congress vote with Republicans having the advantage. At the time, on January 6, 2021, Congress was operating under the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which was written after the presidential election of 1886, which was a complete debacle. The election of 1886 was the most disputed contest in American history up until that time. Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican. Republicans were the good guys back then. He ran against Democrat Samuel Tilden, who I believe is from New York. And it was complete chaos. Separate slates of electors ended up being sent to Washington. It was complete and utter confusion. Nobody knew what to believe. There were charges of voter fraud. And a commission was established And that commission eventually awarded the presidency to Hayes. There was a lot of horse trading. In order for Hayes, the Republican, to get elected president, the horse trading included putting an end to Reconstruction. And so, after that, to prevent this from ever happening again, Congress passed the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which attempted to specify how the Electoral College, how the votes are counted. But most legal scholars, and this is where it gets tricky, and this is where it's going to be hard to prosecute Trump. Most legal scholars admit that the Electoral Count Act of 1887 was ambiguous, poorly written. And because it had just enough ambiguities, all it took was a president like Trump with no respect for constitutional norms. All it took was someone like Trump to bring in a cadre of unscrupulous lawyers willing to work the margins, sow just enough doubt about election fraud, sow just enough doubt about the electoral what is the bill called? The Electoral what is it? I'm sorry. The Electoral Count Act of 1887, to sow just enough doubt about that bill, just enough doubt about how much power Mike Pence had, so enough doubt to suggest that he does have the power not to certify a presidential election. So here's the thing we need to understand about January 6th. Yes, we all know Mike Pence lacked the constitutional authority to obey Donald Trump's orders and refuse to certify the presidential election. Every reasonable legal mind knows that. But as I said, there was just enough ambiguity in the Electoral Count Act of 1887 for Pence to get away with not certifying the election and turning it over to the Supreme Court to decide, which would have served as just enough of a delay to turn the 2020 presidential election into the single worst constitutional crisis in American history. A crisis whereupon Donald Trump has, as president, the emergency powers granted to him by Congress to do whatever he wants and to declare whatever emergency he wants, thanks to the Emergency Powers Act of 1976. So as long as the Republicans went along with him, which we know they would, we would have been into the abyss, because we are not a nation of laws. We are a nation of tribes. We're a nation of people all acting in their own self-interest. The law means nothing in America, okay? All it took was Mike Pence to obey Trump's order on January 6th for this whole thing to come crumbling down. Where there is just a shred of ambiguity in electoral law, there is just enough of an opening to convince Republicans that Trump is well within his rights to order his vice president not to certify, and failure to certify on January 6th would have thrown the 2020 presidential elections into the courts, into the streets, which would have thrown it back to the president, who would declare a series of national emergencies to restore order. That was the plan hatched in the Oval Office by Donald Trump and his lawyers before January 6th. This is what Jack Smith, I hope, will prosecute. There was a plan to create a constitutional crisis. It's the shock doctrine, right? Naomi Klein, you've read that book. Create a crisis. We did that in Chile. Create a man-made crisis. Convince the media and most Americans the system is about to collapse. And then Trump becomes the white knight who restores order while simultaneously stripping us of our constitutional rights. You saw what happened in Bush v. Gore. Most of the Democrats, we would go along with that, for continuity's sake, for stability, right? We would be told Trump is declaring a national emergency because we must assure the bond market that our country isn't going to default. The hell with your constitutional rights. You're being childish. Let the adults in the room take power. We have to make sure that America's political temper tantrum, that's what they would call this, a temper tantrum. We have to make sure that America's temper tantrum doesn't plunge the world into a Great Depression. Let the adults figure this out. America, first and foremost, needs to get back to business. So what if Trump stole an election? There'll be another one in 4 years. Do you want people living on the streets? That's what they would tell us. And most of the scumbags who own stock or own their own homes or have savings and health insurance, they'd go along with it. If you own a home, if you have a job, a mortgage, a savings account, chances are you keep your mouth shut. You call it a temporary constitutional hiccup, because the last thing we need is chaos. Can't have chaos. That's how democracies die. This is exactly how democracies die. The professional managerial class, the upper middle class, they go along with all of this to protect their tiny slice of the pie. And I am telling you, whether you like it or not, all it took was that scumbag, Mike Pence, not to certify the presidential election. All it took was for Mike Pence not to certify the election. It doesn't matter that the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act of 1877 said Pence lacked the authority. There was wiggle room. And wiggle room provides political cover to Republicans like Mike Pence or Kevin McCarthy to decide not to certify. And here's the thing that has flown under the radar about January 6th, and this is really important. There was more wiggle room on January 6th for Mike Pence and Donald Trump than anyone is willing to admit. I'm telling you, if Mike Pence didn't certify, he would have gotten away with it, which is why Congress passed in December of last year a bipartisan bill that reforms the Electoral Count Act of 1887. There was a problem with the Electoral Count Act of 1887. There was an opening for indecent lawyers to provide a constitutional undergirding to Mike Pence refusing to certify. Congress, in December of last year, passed this bill. It was signed into law. They were secretly admitting that Pence had way too much wiggle room on January 6th. He could have said, I'm not certifying this. And they did something about it. In December of last year, they passed this new bill that will prevent Trump or DeSantis. DeSantis is capable of something like this, to prevent somebody like Trump or DeSantis from pulling this shit. The law now specifically specifies that the vice president's role on January 6th is purely ceremonial, and it raises the threshold for members of Congress when they want to challenge the validity of a state's electoral slate. The fact that Congress had to pass a new electoral count vote last December suggests that Trump and his lawyers will now attempt to avoid prosecution on conspiracy to defraud the government with phony electors. They can insist that on January 6, 2021, the Electoral Count Act of 1887 was still applied, and it wasn't clear. They're going to claim that you can't prosecute us for violating a law that at the time was subject to interpretation. I hope I'm making this clear, because this is what's going to be the news from now until Election Day, right? We've got gridlock in Washington. Biden isn't getting anything passed until the Democrats get the House back. So it's just, this is what the news is going to be, unfortunately. It's not going to be climate change. It's not going to be Medicare for all. It's not going to be income inequality. It's this. If or when Jack Smith, the special counsel, indicts Trump on the fake elector scheme, you're going to hear a lot about Trump's lawyers. They are the ones who provided Trump with the constitutional undergirding for his phony electoral scheme, phony elector scheme. Like Hitler, Trump was relying on violence on January 6th. But just like Hitler, he had lawyers backing him every step of the way. I'm going to tell you who these lawyers are that Trump had. Some of them have flown under the radar. Every step of the way, Hitler had lawyers. He ended up with the Enabling Act, the Nuremberg laws, which provided Hitler and his henchmen with all the legal cover they needed to convince ordinary Germans that Hitler was coloring in the lines of the German Constitution when he rounded up dissidents, created concentration camps, and shut down newspapers. I cannot stress this enough. We are not a nation of laws. We are a nation of people. All countries, there's no such thing as laws. Laws are suggestions. They're guardrails that we try to obey. But in the end, we are a nation of people. We are reliant on decent people who know right from wrong. Mike Pence should rot in hell. But on January 6th, he reminded us, it pains me to say this, he reminded us that we are a nation of people, not laws, because laws can be anything the powerful insist they are. We all know that. We are a nation of people who must be willing to defy orders, willing to defy someone else's bogus interpretation of the laws. People. We are a nation of people. Now, Mike Pence is a bad guy. As governor of Indiana, he passed laws that terrorize the LGBTQ community, HIV. There was an epidemic of HIV in Indiana because of his anti-contraception laws, gay people committing suicide. But we came a lot closer on January 6th than most of us are willing to admit. And if Trump somehow served a second term, everything would have been perfectly legal. It would have been his Justice Department. It would have been his FBI exercising prosecutorial discretion. Nobody would be charged with violating any laws because we're not a nation of laws. We're a nation of people. We rely on the decency and the courage of people. And Mike Pence should rot in hell. But on January 6th, he's the hero. Trust me on this. He risked his life to save this country. Now, I will call him a coward because he says January 6th was a riot, not an insurrection. You know, he's trying to thread this needle. He refuses to criticize Trump, says he doesn't think Trump should be prosecuted. But when it came to stepping up and doing the right thing, when it really counted, Mike Pence came through. which is more that can be said for most Republican politicians. We forget this. Hours after the insurrection on January 6, 147 Republicans, including 8 Republican senators, voted against certifying that election. Luckily, they were overruled. But the political will was there to hand Trump another term. All the Republicans needed was more confusion, a bigger constitutional crisis. Had Mike Pence not certified, they would have marched in lockstep around him. If Pence refused to certify the election, Republicans and Democrats would have gone to their respective corners, and it would have been a battle royale with Trump still the commander-in-chief, having at his disposal 136 emergency powers. General Michael Flynn, who served as Trump's national security advisor, briefly, he had to resign after he was caught lying to the FBI about conversations he had with the Russians before Trump took office. Flynn was convicted of lying to the FBI, and Trump pardoned him. So in the lead up to January 6, General Michael Flynn was freelancing, meeting in the Oval Office, coming up with plans for what would come after Mike Pence's refusal to certify. There was a plan. Sidney Powell, Trump's lawyer, was also Michael Flynn's lawyer. There was a plan. It wasn't a spontaneous riot on January 6th. The plan was to create a constitutional crisis, to have rioting in the streets, to have Donald Trump, have people begging Donald Trump to invoke some of his emergency powers. Flynn was drawing up plans for Trump to order the military to seize the ballot boxes. There was a plan in the lead up to January 6th, and all it took was Mike Pence not to certify the election. Doesn't matter what the laws say. Nearly half this country, the entire Republican Party, would have gotten on board. They are on board. They're still spreading the lie that the election was stolen. They're still spreading the lie of voter fraud. All it took was Mike Pence to lie and say he had the constitutional authority not to certify that presidential election. I cannot stress this enough. Mike Pence is the worst human being on the planet, but he saved this country. And if you're confused by all of this, you're supposed to be, because this is how Republicans operate. They create confusion. It's part of the shock doctrine. People are stunned. They don't know what the truth is. What I'm hoping Jack Smith exposes is that Trump's legal team was attempting to create the conditions that led to the 1876 crisis, where Rutherford B. Hayes was awarded the presidency through a commission. When there was so much confusion, the presidency had to be awarded by members of the ruling class. Now, you would have to be a legal scholar to gain a foothold on what transpired in 1876. And it was legal scholars, degenerate lawyers, many of whom graduated from either Yale or Harvard, who were far too willing to assist Trump in creating loopholes in the Electoral Count Act of 1887 to justify whatever emergency powers Trump wanted to invoke to steal the 2020 presidential election. I know I'm a broken record. All it took was Mike Pence not to certify. It's why they wanted to hang Mike Pence. The last thing Donald Trump said on January 6th when he left the Oval Office and went back to the family quarters, the last thing he said is, Mike Pence really let me down today. Now, I'm going to tell you who these lawyers are. I'm hoping that Jack Smith breaks with tradition and prosecutes Trump's lawyers. We have a serious problem with the legal profession here in America. And all these lawyers are facing disciplinary inquiries from their respective bar associations, but none of them has been disbarred yet. This is which tells you how problematic and corrupt the legal profession is. Anybody who's ever been arrested, anybody who ever went through a divorce, or anybody who's ever been sued knows that 90% of American lawyers are spineless, corrupt scumbags. We know that. We need to do something about the legal profession. This is John Eastman. He spoke at Trump's rally on January 6th. He's a former clerk to Justice Clarence Thomas, good friends with Ginny Thomas, also a lawyer, Ginny Thomas. This is John Eastman. He penned several memos in the lead up to January 6th outlining how the vice president could legally refuse to certify. The January 6th committee recommended that our Attorney General charge John Eastman with conspiracy to defraud the federal government and conspiracy to disrupt a federal proceeding. Eastman, though, has not been charged yet. He is currently facing a disbarment trial in the state of California as we speak, and it's dragging on and on and on because it is impossible to disbar a lawyer in the United States. This is Kenneth Chesebro. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name properly. Maybe it's Cheesebro. Let's call him Chesebro. Now, let's call him Cheesebro. This is Kenneth Chesebro, Harvard Law. He has flown under the radar. Nobody knows who this guy is. He wrote a series of memos for Donald Trump calling for Republicans to send an alternate slate of electors to Congress, right? This is what Michigan, the Michigan Attorney General, is currently prosecuting. He wrote the memos. He provided the legal undergirding to Trump orchestrating alternative slates of electors in battleground states that he lost to Joe Biden. This is Kenneth Chesebro. He's a friend of John Eastman. His memos reportedly provided much of the legal heft behind Trump's attempts to convince Republicans in battleground states that were won by Biden. He provided the intellectual and legal heft to convince Republicans in the battleground states to prepare their own slates of electors. According to the New York Times, Chesebro wrote a memo to Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman saying that if Trump, listen to this, if Trump can whip up enough chaos before the January 6th certification, the Supreme Court would be more likely to intervene. There was a plan. The plan was chaos. The plan was so much doubt that the Supreme Court would have to take over and decide the election like they did in Bush v. Gore. In October of last year, Lawyers Defending American Democracy, it's an organization of upstanding members of the legal profession, they filed an ethics complaint against Chesebro for the role he played in organizing the fake elector scheme. They wrote that Chesebro is the mastermind behind key aspects of the fake elector ploy, including he's the mastermind, along with John Eastman, of the legal theory that the vice president had the sole authority to determine the outcome of the presidential election. Lawyers Defending American Democracy point out that that we all know who John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani are, and they are already under ethics investigations from their respective bar associations. They recommend that there should be disciplinary proceedings for the role that Mr. Cheesebro, Harvard Law, there should be disciplinary proceedings for the role that Mr. Cheesebro played in the plan to sow chaos in the lead up to the certification of the presidential election on January 6. So far, his law license has not been taken away from him, and I will be very curious to see if Special Counsel Jack Smith breaks with tradition and starts rounding up the lawyers and prosecuting them. As I said, Hitler used thugs and lawyers. Democracies die not just with brute force, but with brutish lawyers. This is Jeffrey Clark. He attended Harvard, and he was a low-level assistant attorney in the Justice Department under Trump. Nobody knew who he was until Congressman Scott Perry introduced him to Donald Trump in 2020. In the waning days of the Trump administration, President Trump got to know Jeffrey Clark, and Clark proposed that Trump appoint him acting attorney general in the final days of the Trump administration so that he, as attorney general, could launch a full-scale investigation into election fraud. Jeffrey Clark was one of the few lawyers, if not the only lawyer in the Justice Department, who agreed with Trump that former Attorney General Bill Barr and then acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen were dragging their feet on election fraud. Everybody in the Justice Department, including Bill Barr and the guy who replaced him, Jeffrey Rosen, everybody told Donald Trump there is no evidence of voter fraud. But according to what I've been reading and according to the January 6 hearings, Jeffrey Clark, Harvard, said, oh, no. Jeffrey Clark worked in the Justice Department. He said, make me attorney general. There is evidence that Dominion voting machines were being accessed by the Chinese government through the hacking of smart thermostats. This is what Jeffrey Clark allegedly believed or was willing to say. He was saying that the Chinese were hacking our thermostats and switching the votes in the Dominion machines. And Trump, in the lead up to January 6, days before January 6, Trump was prepared to name him Attorney General. And there was a meeting in the Oval Office, and Jeffrey Rosen, the acting Attorney General, I think O'Donoghue, I think that's his name, his underling, they came to the meeting. Trump's legal counsel was there, and Trump said, you know what, I'm going to replace you with Jeffrey Clark, make him the Attorney General. And to Jeffrey Rosen, the acting Attorney General's credit, he said, if you do that, you will have no Justice Department. The entire Justice Department, made up of a lot of Republicans, by the way, they will all quit. And they spooked Trump into not appointing Jeffrey Clark as acting Attorney General. In July of last year, the D.C. Bar charged Jeffrey Clark, Harvard, with engaging in dishonest conduct and seeking to seriously interfere with the administration of justice during his attempts to help Trump spread lies about voter fraud in the 2020 election. Now, Clark has tried to tie these disciplinary hearings up in court, but last month the D.C. Bar got the go-ahead from a federal judge to continue with the trial, the disbarment trial of Jeffrey Clark, Harvard. It will be interesting to see what indictments special counsel Jack Smith hands down either today or tomorrow or next week. Democracies die. They normally do. They die when muscle triumphs over reason. And there are two types of muscle. There's the physical muscle we saw on January 6th when they stormed the Capitol. But like Hitler, Trump also relied on faux intellectual muscle provided by third-rate legal minds who feel slighted by the system. I went to Harvard. Why am I a lowly assistant attorney general? Democracies don't die solely at the end. Democracies don't die just because of extrajudicial violent thugs. Democracies are killed ultimately by lawyers. Democracies are killed by lawyers willing to find loopholes that don't exist, willing to violate constitutional norms, and provide both an intellectual and legal undergirding to fascism. I know you're not supposed to bring up Hitler, but it was the lawyers who enabled Hitler. It was actually called the Enabling Act, by the way. I don't know if special counsel Jack Smith is going to prosecute John Eastman, Jeffrey Clark, Kenneth Chesebro, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Lin Wood. I haven't even talked about Lin Wood, who is or was Marjorie Taylor Greene's attorney. I don't know if special counsel Jack Smith is going to go after these rank amateurs of the legal profession who twisted the law into knots for their own emotional and financial needs. These are highly educated, somewhat gifted legal minds who felt betrayed, left out, and through Trump, they were going to prove how smart they were and move up. Democracy be damned. I don't know when exactly Jack Smith is going to hand down these indictments. Maybe he won't. I don't know. And I don't know what Trump is going to be charged with specifically. I hope I laid out for you what is likely to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. I do know we have a serious problem with the legal profession here in America. It is impossible to disbar these lawyers. So far, what is it, more than 2 years after January 6th? Only Lin Wood is the only lawyer so far who's officially lost his license. Rudy Giuliani has had his license suspended in New York and Washington, D.C., but he has not been disbarred. Lin Wood is the only one who surrendered his license. He wasn't disbarred. Lin Wood voluntarily surrendered his license, claiming, you know what, it's time for me to retire. Sidney Powell, she's being investigated in Texas, still hasn't been disbarred. John Eastman, this disbarment in California is dragging on and on. It is impossible to disbar an attorney here in America. Think about this for a second. If you can't even disbar Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, and Chesebro for trying to overthrow the United States government, which seems to be the case. If you cannot disbar a lawyer in America for conspiring to overthrow the government of the United States, what chance do you and I have taking a lawyer before the bar for phony claims and fake billing. We have a problem in America with lawyers. 80% of them are scumbags, and they are partly responsible for the destruction of our democracy and our ability to ascertain what the truth is. I hope Jack Smith prosecutes these lawyers, but professional courtesy, right? I doubt he's going to do that. I'm David Feldman, reminding you to stay strong and protect the weak. Thank you. This is part 2 of July 20th, 2023. My internet went out, so if you're watching this right now, there's a part 1, and I apologize. Please share these videos. It's the only way this podcast can grow. Please like this video. Please subscribe to my channel. What else? That's it. Thank you to everybody in the chat room for finding the part 2. Thank you for helping the audience come to part 2. And thank you for all your comments. I will see you tomorrow night around midnight Eastern. Thank you all very much.